Welcome to this video about the difference between description and analysis, brought to you by the Writing Center. I'm often asked about the difference between description and analysis, or the difference between a summary and an analysis. The difference is straightforward and it applies to all fields. Take an example from science. Let's say that you've run an experiment and you have the data from the experiment in front of you. That is your evidence. Obviously, in humanities and other fields, other types of evidence apply. Could be quotations, statistics, ideas from other people's work. In any case, you have your evidence in front of you. Going back to science, in your lab report, in your results section, you need to describe the data you've obtained. What does it look like? What patterns, for instance, are evident, or what anomalies are evident? Your results section calls upon you to describe those patterns or those anomalies. But that isn't enough. It's really only description. What scientists would now do is turn to their discussion section and tell us what that data, those patterns, those anomalies you found mean in relation to the question you asked or the hypothesis you stated, and also to the state of knowledge in the field. So meaning is all important. It's the step beyond mere description, wherein description means telling us what those patterns are. Analysis means telling us what those patterns mean. So let me reiterate this point before moving on to an example. Description means telling us what you found or what you've observed. That might be patterns, it might be disruptions, it might be anomalies. Analysis means taking the step beyond description to tell us what those findings or patterns or observations mean. And you need to tell us what they mean in relation to the question you've asked or the thesis you've stated. And the higher you go in academics, the more you will also be asked what those findings or observations mean in relation to the current state of knowledge in the field. Let's go a step further and take a look at an example. Let's say that you were asked to explore the use of light and darkness in the film Hidden Figures. You watched the film carefully and you discovered that the main female characters are often shown coming out of darkness into light. And in fact, you've gathered specific evidence from several points in the film to demonstrate that this pattern does occur. And so your observations might be, first, that the main character, Mary, comes from the darkness of the tunnel into the light surrounding the space capsule. And you point out, even in the tunnel, her face is lit up. The second main character, Dorothy, walks from the darkness of the hallway into the light of the computer room. And thirdly, Catherine, another main character, is shut out into darkness when she reaches the flight room after making calculations that allow astronaut John Glenn to fly. The hallway is light, and when the door closes in her face, darkness falls on her face. The use of light and darkness that you've observed makes patterns. In your paper, you will describe these moments and this pattern for us. So far, so good, but that isn't enough. Describing what happens is not enough. You found a pattern, you've described what happens, and you've provided evidence that the pattern you've observed does exist. That's description. Now you have to tell us what that pattern or observation means. Each time you make an observation like this one, women coming out of darkness into light, or the reverse, you need to tell us what the evidence means in relation to the question being asked or the thesis you've written. Each time you describe something that happens, a pattern of metaphors, a pattern of disruption, we ask, so what? What does that mean? In the case of Hidden Figures, the pattern of seeing women moving from darkness into light might mean that these women are breaking the barriers of race and gender that have been imposed upon them. That's analysis. When you tell us the significance of your findings and evidence. Darkness, in keeping with what we just said about light, light means hope and the potential or actual breaking down of barriers of gender and race. Darkness means the shutting out of Black women at NASA and the imposing of those barriers. I would add a note here that I did observe on an earlier slide that Catherine is shut out and darkness falls on her face. Immediately after that, the shut door opens, the light falls on Catherine's face, and she is welcomed into the flight room. And so the barriers fall. You need to tell us what your findings or observations mean to move to analysis. You have to answer the so what question. This is analysis. As the example shows, you tell us what the evidence or the pattern or the disruption means. What does it show us? What does it tell us? What does it answer? You need to make this move from description to analysis, to telling us what your finding means for every major point or pattern you include in your paper. At the end, when you arrive at a full answer to your question, you then, in your conclusion, tell us the overall meaning or significance of that answer in relation to the question. I'm going to reiterate that point again about where you should include analysis. Each of your main points should describe some pattern in the evidence or data that you found, or some disruption to it in the case of some fields. Once you have described that pattern or the evidence, you must tell us what it means. That meaning is analysis, and you must include it for every main point you make in your paper. And so you move from evidence, description of that evidence, to analysis of that evidence, from showing us to telling us the meaning of the evidence. Let's look at one more example, this time from student Jonathan Klodman's award-winning paper, Used for Educational Purposes with Jonathan's Permission. Jonathan compared news coverage of the 2015 CUPE strike at York with news coverage of the public school teachers' strike in Ontario, which took place 2 months later. According to Jonathan, when he did his study, CUPE strikers obtained public sympathy while public school teachers did not. He therefore asked the research question, how do differences in news coverage between two incidents of job action contribute to such different public perspectives of the job actions themselves? Midway through his essay, or his research report, Jonathan studied the images that accompanied news organizations' coverage of each strike. Here's his paragraph on the next slide about the photos that accompanied the public school strike coverage. Read this paragraph carefully. The first sentence tells us what to expect in this paragraph, that is, what he's going to show us. And the first half of the paragraph describes the evidence that Jonathan has collected. That evidence consisted of faceless images of teachers or no images of teachers, with the most telling images included being those of the union president and the provincial government representative. Jonathan describes those findings first, the patterns he found when he looked at news coverage. He then moves to analysis in the second half of the paragraph, to telling us what this evidence and these patterns mean throughout the last part of the paragraph. You'll find that on the next screen highlighted in yellow. Notice the structure of this single paragraph. The first sentence in green gives an overall summary of what this paragraph will tell us, and that is coverage of the ETFO job action barely featured individuals' members' faces or stories at all. So we are primed to understand what to expect in the rest of the paragraph. The blue section of the paragraph describes the evidence. That is, the photos literally cut the faces of the teachers right out of the photos. Please notice throughout this section the number of citations. These are proof that Jonathan did indeed analyze news coverage. We can go to these pieces and we can find the photos that he's referring to. It's especially important that you cite your sources as you write. So the first part of the paragraph describes what Jonathan found when he looked. The second part of the paragraph in yellow moves to analysis. That is, telling us what the evidence he's just described means. And so we read, given the images of these men who sat alone indoors in their comfortable suits, the implicit narrative that emerged suggested that both sides were equally rich and powerful. And we continue on to find that Jonathan gives the meaning of the evidence right through the second half of the paragraph. He does end with a sentence that summarizes the meaning and what he has found. And that is, despite the fact that elementary teachers can be found in every single community in Ontario, the impersonal nature of the coverage made it more difficult for a reader to both figuratively and literally see the people at the center of the story. That statement, of course, is directly related to the research question that we saw a couple of minutes ago. So, to end, always keep these steps in mind when you are striving to gather evidence and to move from summary or description to analysis. Your first step is to gather evidence that's related to the question you're asking or the thesis statement you're arguing. Evidence can be in the form of data, quotations, observations, whatever's appropriate for your field. You then want to organize your evidence or group it into main points. Next, you want to provide the evidence for each main point in your paper, and you want to describe it. But after that, you need to move to analysis for each of your main points by telling us what that evidence you've just described means in relation to your question. Always, always, always ask yourself once you've described the evidence, so what? And give us the meaning or the significance that that evidence points to in relation to your question or thesis. And once again, I invite you to visit the Writing Center, where you can get free 50-minute video chats with knowledgeable writers or 15-minute drop-ins for quick questions you might have. We also run workshops every term. Remember that writing is learning for life, and putting the time and effort in now for learning opportunities with knowledgeable writers can stand you in good stead for life. Just come to our website, click to register, and book your own appointments, or you can search for Writing Center on York's site. Thank you for listening, and welcome to the Writing Center.